Thanks for joining us in the Gun Gallery today. We're going to give you a virtual guided tour of our new exhibition, The Art of Trees. This exhibition is a really unique curatorial effort that was led by 3 of our Gun Associates, student interns, who I would love to introduce you to now. Willow Green. Willow is a dance and English double major with a creative writing focus. Katie Heilman is a modern languages and literature major in German and Italian. And Rebecca Utian is a studio art and art history double major in Italian minor. I'm Jody Kovach. I'm the curator of academic programs, and I had the pleasure of mentoring these 3 curatorial leaders and a team of associates in working with a group of faculty and staff, Gun Gallery staff and college staff, on imagining this exhibition. The premise for this exhibition was founded on this questioning of the Anthropocene and problems with the environmental crisis. And we were starting to question how art can maybe mediate differences in the scientific and political thinking on the environmental crisis. And so we came together and found that trees were the perfect subject matter for entering into a dialogue about our relationship with nature and how we might be able to change that. So today we're going to take you through the exhibition, and Rebecca, Katie, and Willow are going to talk about key works, just to kind of give you a preview. And they're also going to talk a bit about the curatorial process, the decisions that they made in choosing the works on view, the research they conducted, and the writing that they did. And we hope that you'll come to the gallery and if you're on campus to see the exhibition in person. It's definitely worthwhile, but we're happy that we can have you here virtually today. Please put questions in the chat, and at the end of the guided tour, we're going to take questions and answer those. So we welcome all questions you have and look forward to having a dialogue about this. So now I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to our associates, and they're going to just lead us through.
I thought that we would start with the poem that you see upon entering the gallery right now, which is a poem by Royal Rhodes, who I was able to work closely with on his collection, which referenced both site-specific and more expansive experiences of nature. This one is one of the ones that's more theme-relevant to the exhibition, but we're also planning on taking a series of poetry walks with students on campus and possibly also recording with some of the site-specific poems. But I'll read this one. The Uprooting. Workmen rolled the tiny lights in reeds before the heartwood felt the biting blade. We praise our Mother Earth, but do not see the ancient rights of trees that we uproot. We could not name the birds that nested here, but what we owned we later chose to kill. I used to say each death was like a vast library burned, but now I want to add that death is like a line of trees cut down, trees whose fluent leaves once spoke aloud about a century of watching us, whispering and hearing what our lives were like unfolding in a holy place, the wedding canopy for every life. The leaning trees recorded voices, raised in rage and laughter, weeping words of love, words we spoke the first or final time, exchanges that kept generations linked. In sunlight, moonlight, and in lengthened shadows, each tree concealed a golden bough, a key that opened up the gate that leads below, or reaches the universe's crown. And in the wind's resuscitating rush, we hear a pardon from the things we kill. The falling foliage once grazed our eyes, but nothing now nears the shooting stars. And I particularly enjoyed this aspect of Royal's poems that focused on intergenerational experiences of one specific place, because when it's expansive, it certainly applies to other places, but it's something unique about college campuses like Kenyon's to come through the same place and live through it, but not necessarily know all of its history. And so you find from this poem and also other poems that he's written that are included in this exhibition, both critique and reflection and just commemorating what he's witnessed in his 40 years of living in Gambia. Yeah.
Going off the multi-generational and sort of the theme around reflecting years and generations is Barry Gunderson's work. I had the amazing privilege of working with Barry, and his sort of collection of tree lamps stems from the idea of bringing childhood sort of back to life in the adult world, and a lot of his trees have sort of different funky names and are based on very sort of quirky different sort of fruits. This one particularly reminds me of South Africa's national flower, the green protea. And so this idea for creating art objects that are also useful was based on the fact that he couldn't find lamps when he went shopping for lamps, and decided that he might as well create his own. And so this became a project that sort of moved on throughout the years and ended in these beautiful lamps. And I particularly love them just because they each seem to have a life of their own and have a personality. So I think it's a great way of sort of entering the gallery and coming into the space.
What he calls cameraless photographs. He makes these negatives by hand, and basically he's exposing the different parts of these leaves. Something that I found really interesting while choosing these along with the rest of the curatorial team was how the background often correlates with the patterns that we see on the leaves as well. So these negatives, as I said, are made by hand and printed out on inkjet.
So right behind Professor Spade's work is some more of Barry Gunderson's work. These are shade trees. They basically are just beautiful representations of the shadows that trees cast onto the ground, and an exploration in the patterns and the beauty that we can see in the things that aren't necessarily always seen and taken notice of. I love these. Again, they're a beautiful connection to the lamps as well. So I can talk about this one. This is a book by Professor Ellen Sheffield. It also, I think, bridges a gap quite beautifully between sculpture and text. And so you can kind of see it's a very beautiful example of book arts. I took a book arts class with Professor Sheffield, and it was an excellent class. I really enjoyed it. Yeah.
And then this is an installation, or rather part of a larger installation that Parents Software adapted to be included in Nearby Voices. Each of these trees is a real tree, which I found frankly shocking, but it's so beautiful. They were taken from Michigan, and they commemorate a memory of Parents Software's father, I'm so sorry, or her father. Each of the flowers, they actually create a scent in the air when you're physically here. And it's meant to be an immersive experience of his memory that she holds. One of the things I like about this installation is that it also carries this idea of witnessing, because the trees for her are a witness of the relationship she has to her father, as well as a more intimate memory of her father that I recommend reading personally if you're able to visit the exhibition.
Yeah, and so while we're just in this last sort of section of Nearby Voices, what I found really lovely about the show is that it's an entrance into the the artworks that are on loan as well. And it's very interesting to note that all the artists, these 5 artists, are all Gambia residents. And so I think that's a very interesting idea about place and bearing witness to place as well.
Yeah, and even as the rest of the exhibition will come to a close, the ones that we've loaned in April, this part of the exhibition will be staying up throughout the summer, so feel free to come at any time and look at these beautiful works of art from some of our professors and Gambia residents.
Yeah, and I'll just add that the artists featured in this section of the exhibition were very invested in the planning process too. When we convened the interdisciplinary committee in the fall of 2019, they were very much a part of helping to host our guest speakers who came to speak on various topics related to trees and the ecological crisis. And they worked very closely with the associates to share their own ideas about how their art kind of contributed to a broader dialogue, how we could sort of negotiate a local conversation and bigger global issues. And so it helped, I think, kind of expand your research significantly. So let's walk into the next gallery.
This is Juniper Forest by Hiroshi Sugimoto. And the thing I find particularly interesting about this work is that it plays a lot of tricks on you. It is actually a photograph of a diorama, so it's completely manipulating the concept of a landscape photograph. The large scale makes you believe that this is an in real life experience that Sugimoto had, but instead it's a capturing of an artificial landscape, which contributes to other conversations that we'll have throughout the exhibition.
Yeah, I wondered if you could comment, or any of you could comment a bit about, more about the artificial landscape. Why is that, what does this tell us about why that's so compelling to us, or the ways that we get to know the natural world?
Yeah, I'm happy to talk about it. Well, I think that throughout the exhibition, people sort of tackle that conversation in different ways, but something I found interesting about different iterations of artificial landscape is that it's about how there's an interest in curating our relationship to the environment and curating our relationship to nature. And depending on how you curate that relationship as an artist, like we receive different information. I think with Sugimoto, there's critique for sure, but with other artists you'll see more of an explicit critique on the idea of experiencing an artificial landscape. But I think that just the concept of illusionary nature in a world where we're increasingly destroying the actual environment is an interesting use of art.
Yeah. Exactly. Okay, and so then on this wall, moving over, another sort of monochromatic, 2 works of art actually are by James Chronister. I had the privilege of writing about these works, and I particularly like them just because of the sort of abstract nature of them when you're very up close to them, and then as you sort of get further away from them, they actually make sense to your eye. And this painting that you're seeing right now on the right, I think is very beautiful at the moment because it's very much what Gambia looks like outside. And so I think what I found interesting about Chronister's process is that a lot of the work that he creates come from archival photographs, and the process by which he creates his works of art are very much like pointillism and hyperrealism. So he works in small segments and paints just very, very small details of black and white pigment onto the canvas. And then sort of at the end, he creates these beautiful monochromatic pieces of work that look almost like photographs, but have a very hyperrealistic view and sort of essence about them that make them seem a little bit less photographic. So,
and the title of this series is, forgive me, I'm going to mispronounce it most likely, but it's Taiga. And I I didn't know until today. I was talking with Professor Gebhardt, and he recognized that as a Danish word that he told me means cozy. And I think that that's really, it kind of sets up a contrast with this painting. And yes, it's I think it has cozy connotations, or maybe it evokes those feelings when we think about being wintertime inside, looking out. But there's something very mechanical about his painting process. You know, he uses these very, very tiny dots. It's black and white. And so that conjures for me a sense of alienation. And it makes me think about how we represent nature and how we've established a sense of alienation from it. We have to observe it and scrutinize it and replicate it in order to know it. And yet through that, we know less and less about it, it seems. We become more alienated. Should we move on?
Yeah, that's a very beautiful way to put it.
Yeah.
I remember the moment when I texted Rebecca and said, oh, it's just a banister outside today.
Okay, so this work is by Anne Appleby. I find it particularly beautiful because it very much reminds me of a palette, which I think it does for most of you, different colors, and it traces the different seasons and the colors that predominantly stand out in different seasons. I think there's something really beautiful about the simplicity of the work, and it sort of makes you think about the colors that surround us and just what the natural environment gives to us throughout the seasons and throughout different years.
And I would also like to talk about the piece right next to it, this giant sequoia tree. Basically what you see here, this work by James Bella, is first of all a very incredibly large tree, which you can see a man climbing and standing at the very top. He basically took fragmented photographs of this tree and kind of stitched them together in order to create this very incredible representation of the sequoia. You will also be able to find this photograph on the outside of the gallery when you walk in. It's a great representation of kind of what we're going for with this sort of manipulation of nature, I believe, because he took these different pieces, these different photographs, and arranged the pieces into the full picture of the tree. And that kind of speaks to one of the larger themes of this exhibition, in my opinion, about how human interference in the natural world has become a norm in a way. And I think that's very important to acknowledge here, even though it is incredibly stunning, and obviously the nature here wasn't harmed.
Yeah, I'd just like to say, as we circle around this room real quick, not real quick, necessarily, the sublime and beautiful in nature, and even the romanticizing of nature, and how because the Joel Sternfeld photographs harken back to 19th century American landscape painting and ideas of manifest destiny. Anne Appleby portrays nature in a mode that invokes contemplation. So this is a room where we can reflect on, I think, how we use nature, how we think it's there for us. And I like this quote up on the wall. I wonder if one of you would like to read it.
I was eyeing it. One of the great dreams of man must be to find some place between the extremes of nature and civilization where it is possible to live without regret. By Barry Lopez. I was thinking about this room as an interesting case study of the sublime in the variety of ways you can I mean, it's not the right word, but with Anne Appleby's, which at first seems like a reduction, is actually an expansion of looking at what makes up what we see in a landscape. Because you can almost attach Appleby's study to Sternfeld's landscape.
Yeah, that's wonderful.
And then, let's move on. Yeah, I know.
So much.
I'll get like reference on because I think they're easier to understand. So Jan Wayne Preston's work is actually part of an 8-year project called Forest. I can scan so you can see. But over these 8 years, she actually sought out to chronicle what she was seeing in terms of China's forest policy and how it was shaping urban cities, but particularly Chongqing. She was interested in this case study of it because in Chongqing they take trees from more rural areas and then transplant them into city centers, which is I think most visible in these. But the process involves like literally wrapping a tree in plastic, as is shown in the first photo, and then sticking it with needles for nutrition and then transporting it in large trucks. And it's not so much that she's saying that this is 100% a negative thing, but Preston is interested in showing how we go about constructing a forest in a place where it is no longer because of us or because of human intervention. So when she shows these mature trees in settings where they clearly didn't grow, she's commenting on the curation of a natural center in the city. The other thing that she writes about in terms of this project is how in other places where people are focusing a little bit more on like logistically actually trying to reintegrate a forest, they'll plant saplings. But when you take these mature trees, it can often actually be for the aesthetic rather than for the natural gain and for the protection of the city's natural environment. I found these ones also interesting. I was like, why is this tarp here? Which I think, at first I was like, oh, they're just covering the side. And they are literally using this green tarp-like material to disguise like a human-built wall. And again, I think Preston does an interesting job of not necessarily aiming to say that these decisions are completely negative things, because in some ways they become a necessity of human life. But she does want to show that like over the years, the way that we make decisions often moves away from environmental concern to aesthetic or commodified interest, and how something that starts as a good idea can end up being manipulated into a less like environmentally informed project. Yeah.
Well said.
All right, so as we go into the next room, my personal favorites are in this one, and these are works that I researched a lot personally, and I believe in a way are a more optimistic vision of what we've seen so far in the art of trees. So these works by Matthew Grant initiate a dialogue with the earth itself, and his process is incredibly interesting. So what he will do is he took these beautiful pictures in Lanai, Hawaii, and instead of just displaying the photographs, he wrapped each of these photographs in either burlap or lace, and then he buried them under the ground on a farm in Lanai, Hawaii. And over time, with water and leaves and dirt, and then these photographs wrapped in either burlap or lace, erosion began to happen throughout the photographs. So sometimes, like in the one you're currently seeing, it obscures a lot. But in other photographs, we see there's still like a very clear image of what is behind all of this erosion. The reason I look at this as more optimistic is because it engages with the earth, you know, one-on-one. Like, Matthew Grant was really hoping to have this be a conversation, and I think that's really powerful because we often forget when we are, you know, either taking pictures of, or we are painting or engaging with the natural world, we're trying to create a product that comes from, you know, what we see nature as, whereas he really allows the earth to do its speaking for itself. And I think it just engages really, really well with the natural world.
Yeah, and I think that it speaks a lot to the improvisational capabilities of nature.
Exactly. Yeah, and every single one is different, and in a way that makes it all the more enjoyable because you never know what you're going to get when you dig it out of the ground. And so I just found the entire process incredibly inspiring in a way because it really reinforces this connection that we can have with these different works of art, and how the earth can respond to these works of art.
Katie, as you're talking, I'm thinking about, it makes these paintings, or these photographs, I think of them as paintings because they have such a natural quality to them. In their tactility, in the improvisational kind of happening qualities of them. But it's making me actually question what we mean by nature. I think that the term nature has often alluded to ideas of the maternal, or either something that we care for, that we're caretakers of the earth. But here he's turned his creative process over completely to the soil. But not just the soil, there's everything. I mean, we think of how interconnected everything is and interdependent. The roots, the rain, and that really comes alive in his artistic language in a way that I think maybe only visual art can do.
Yeah, and he describes his work as messy and experimental. And usually when you think about artwork, you don't think about the word messy per se. You think that it's always trying to, at least in the more general sense of art, portray something that is aesthetically beautiful and like within certain confines of what we describe as beautiful. And here I think this takes beauty to a completely different level. And these iridescent colors that come from the erosion, they just really further the conversation that we can have when we are ourselves in nature and when we ourselves are trying to create work that accurately represents the earth and the world that we live in.
I think that's a perfect transition to Maria Gonzalez's work. And one of the themes of the show that we used in the early stages of coming up with the concept for the show was the earth and the landscape as a collaborator with the artist. And so Maria Elena Gonzalez's work is based on taking striations from tree bark and basically using those to find lines and let the tree sort of dictate these markings. So if you can see these darker markings right over here, those are taken from the striations. And so these works reveal a lot of the process that she's used. And once we've sort of gone through this, we can go into the next room and see what actually becomes of this. And it's basically this idea that creating sort of scores or musical scores from the striations on these trees and using those to create music. So if you come through here, you can see the manifestation of that in musical scores that can be used on self-playing pianos, which I think is just so incredible because it really is a direct collaboration with nature. So you can see some of those same markings that were on the pictures on the outside sort of cut out of this, this thin paper. And so if you can hear music in the background, on the screen right over here, this is the self-playing piano actually creating sort of the sound that came from that tree bark. we'll be moving into the second to last room, a room I'm particularly in love with.
You all a moment to kind of take this in.
Steinkamp's work revisits this question I was having throughout our curatorial process about artificial curation of tree and natural experience. In this case, it was actually funny how this came to mind for me, but Jody was already familiar with Steinkamp as well. But I encountered this projection series for the first time through a TV show, which is called The Aware, and I like to recommend it to people because it also connects very well to many of the themes that you see in this exhibition. But I also then saw it in the North Carolina Museum of Art, and I thought it was interesting to sort of have this like through line of context to experience this in, because in my first context it was quite literally creating an artificial tree in someone's home. And so to then see it in a museum space commenting on our relationships to environment and trees, and then to be able to actually include it in an exhibition I helped curate about relationships we cultivate with nature through art, was just compelling to me to finally see it in person like this, in which I watch a tree grow in faster time than I ever could before me, and how that's like both a gift and an interesting commentary on reproducing nature. Like, we often look at these questions where if people can produce things digitally, do we need what's real? But when you stand in this room, there is still the absence of the living thing. And it's almost a direct creation of that absence by including it inside as a digital production.
Great. We have one more gallery, and I think that in the interest of time, we'll just focus on maybe one artist's work, and then we'll open it up to questions. But I will say that later this semester, we're going to have Professor Orca Tierney give a talk on this digital simulation here by the artist John Gerard, and she'll be speaking from her expertise pertaining to gaseous modernities. And we are looking forward to inviting artist Laura McPhee later this semester to give a virtual talk about her work in the collection.
Okay. Last but not least are three works by Edward Bertinsky. These are just incredible aerial shots of different spaces and really comment on how we really are damaging the earth, but also the beauty in that, the way that they appear, and that strangeness and how something like that can, for example, in this picture, actually look like a tree. Really inverts that idea of what we find beautiful, and really makes us question the actions we're taking on global scales. I absolutely love his photography. Most of it is taken in the air, as you can see for this one as well, which is palm oil plantation. So yeah, at first glance they really seem beautiful, but I think once you start reading into them and actually researching the work that Bertinsky does, you realize how damaging and harmful the pictures he's taking, the things he is taking pictures of actually are to the environment. And then this is the last one by him, oil fields. So these are oil pipes actually running through the field. This one looks very sort of unnaturalistic. It looks almost like it's been superimposed there or done through Photoshop, but it is in fact a real photograph. So
It might be fun to guide into a Q&A with me talking about how Bertinsky is one of the first works.
Oh yes.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, Bertinsky is fairly well known for very well known for these types of photographs. And so one of the former leaders on the curatorial team, Daniela Grande, was very, very drawn to this specific artist for the reason that his works so directly speak to these topics that we were thinking about, and the destruction of nature, and sort of the ghosts of the landscape and those changes that happen over time.
I feel like something also very important to mention is how, because of this aerial sort of perspective that we get, we are kind of the outsiders looking in, and that creates an interesting dynamic with how we look at these works. It's often similarly compared to, kind of this westernized separation from all of the destruction that the Western world has caused. And I think in his photographs, which we were able to talk about, when we first started looking at Bertinsky, he really gives us that dimension, and we have to try as observers in this sense to basically overcome that and really look at the landscape for what it is, like Rebecca said.
Well, why don't we open it up to questions now? And do we have some from our audience?
We don't have anything quite yet, but I have a question.
Excellent.
So this is Caroline, the director of digital, actually communication and engagement now, everybody. But I was wondering about the works right behind you. So could you speak about these? These are wonderful.
Actually, I'm going to start with this one.
Okay, we have to start over here.
So I found Laura Plakeman's work when I was researching during my first year in the curatorial team when I was not quite a leader yet. But I found this by looking up kudzu art because I'm from originally rural North Carolina and now Raleigh. But I grew up, anytime I would go basically anywhere, just everything's coated in kudzu, and it was even a topic because urban environmental studies is required where I'm from. And so when I discovered this image of it and was trying to explore like what kudzu's actual impact was on the landscape and on the trees, that I guess there's a whole discussion about native versus not native plants or plant lives and species. But I was struck by how she captured the notion that kudzu is swallowing the landscape, which is how people often refer to it. But she still did it in a way that was beautiful and more about. She shares the same anecdote as I have created. It's hard to explain, but when you're a kid watching the kudzu across the landscape, you see these like monsters almost crawling out, and it's beautiful. As a kid, there's just like a whole scope of imagination to be held there, and so I loved how she created this sea, and then I became interested in how, and you can see it a little bit more clearly in these other images. She reconstructed these places that she had taken photos of to match her experience of them rather than what you might call a factual representation or a literal representation. She rejects the idea that what she's created here is an illusion and instead emphasizes how they're more authentic to the essence of the place rather than like the tangible objects there. So you can see in that one that she physically crumpled the paper, and then she re-photographs after these manipulations of the original photo.
That is so cool.
It's
how she really distorts her perspective and makes this just look like a tangled web of meshes. A word that I think is used sometimes in the literature recently to describe the natural world, this kind of unwieldy, uncontrollable, constantly like multiplying and evolving and living and dying and thriving, and it really expresses our inability to know it and control it.
Yeah. That one particularly, I think, shows a distortion of perspective. Suddenly there's all these trees squished onto a little hill.
Exactly.
Even though I'm sure, or I can imagine her, like in real life experience, that it would have been more of a flat or rolling landscape, but definitely not just trees perched like on a bench.
Yeah.
We have a question for you guys. Annika Ostrom, who you probably know. Hi, Annika. We're all glad to see you virtually.
We should note that Annika was one of the lead curators in this project. She graduated in May of 2020.
Yeah,
so
yeah, she's
her a lot.
yeah. She said she's so proud of you that this show looks beautiful. And she was wondering if you could address the amount of photographers who are shown in this exhibition, how you think about that work included.
I have like some thoughts immediately, which is that I think, and I'm sure Annika probably helped us get there, but there are many photographers included, but a lot of the photographers we show are also working with manipulations of photographic form, as with Laura Kligman's work. Bertinsky, I suppose, could be called in a more literal photographic way, but at the same time, his aerial point of view adds a new dimension to the landscape art.
Yeah, and as we saw with Matthew Grant, you know, he lets the earth kind of take the last hand in the creation of his artwork. And with James Belloc, how he, you know, had the snippets and then he kind of sewed them together to create this incredible image of a sequoia tree.
This leads me thinking about how, if these are the photographers we're finding and the works we found resonated most with our themes, maybe there's something that a simple, not simple, but you know, a traditional act of photography can't capture in nature that we're looking for in terms of this conversation.
And a lot of these artists were inspired by traditional photography. I feel like it's important to mention that. You know, traditional photography is somewhere where I feel like all photographers start. They kind of build their own medium as they get more experience with their work. And I think what we've chosen to display in this exhibition has really been those individual cultivated mediums and just how different you can portray the natural world with photography based on, you know, just certain aspects that you really want to hone in on when you're doing it.
Yeah. It also raises the question of what's real and what's represented, because walking in nature can never, is such an amazing experience, and I think taking a photograph can never quite replicate that. Making a painting can never quite replicate that. And I think something about the work that these photographers and artists are creating sort of speaks to that notion of, yes, we're collaborating with nature and taking these photographs, but no, they'll never quite match up to the real thing.
Exactly.
I'm thinking too, a lot in response to what you're saying now, that the use of photography, you know, is a digital or mechanical device, and our assumptions about photography giving us an objective representation of something. It's almost like a scientific means of understanding, of knowing, of learning about the subject. So I think it can be, you know, if we go with that assumption. So if we think about how the artists are using this medium in really innovative ways, and in dialogue with other traditions, artistic traditions, how they're bringing together these two different, what are often thought of as two different ways of thinking, two different sort of forms of knowledge, science and art. And I think that's something that you all were thinking about, either, you know, maybe not at a really sort of conscious level, but it was sort of an undercurrent in a lot of the dialogue that you were having as they were doing their research, and as you were workshopping all of the texts that are written, the explanatory texts on the walls. So this is something that was part of their curatorial process over a year and a half. And do we have another question?
We have a couple more questions.
Great.
So yeah, this
this
is good. Yeah. So here's a question from Peter. Do you think there's an underlying dichotomy or conflict due to the fact that natural resources are used to create a lot of this artwork? I do appreciate the collaborative aspect with nature and thoughtfulness put into the pieces. So what do you guys have to comment on that?
As is there? Yes. As you were talking about Grant, it does always come to my mind, you had to physically dig a hole, which is still an intervention.
Yeah.
There's a lot of questions to be held there. I wish that we had Orchids talk already prepared, because I feel like this one goes in really well. But yeah, I think that some of them think critically. Some of the artists we've included think critically about that simultaneous usage of medium that is like natural resources, and some of them are not necessarily responding to that. But Matthew Grant, I think, certainly is commenting on himself just as much as he's commenting on collaboration.
Yeah.
And we have one more question. Chris Fallman would you like to talk a little bit more through the process of what you followed to create this exhibition? How especially were you working with the local artists who were involved?
That was probably my favorite part, honestly. So as a sophomore, I was able to, specifically before COVID, we were able to visit the studios of Professor Spade, Professor Gunderson, and actually just interact with them and become friends with them, which I think is a major part of curating an exhibition. You need to know who you're dealing with, the background of the people, and the art that they create and why they create it. And so I thought that was an incredible part of what we were doing, and made it a lot more meaningful, I think, as well, because we got to have their input and their years of expertise in their fields of creating art and bridging gaps. And I think what's also lovely about working with sort of local people, as well as not only the artists but professors and some of the talks that we had leading up to the exhibition, is that we got to learn as individuals ourselves about a lot of these topics. And I think that so enriched my own Kenyon experience. And I think a lot of the curatorial associates from previous years, as well as this year right now, were really positively impacted by the people who came and visited Kenyon. And I think it very much spurs thought into all sorts of different disciplines. And because Kenyon is such an interdisciplinary college, I think that it's very beneficial for no matter what subject you're studying or what your major is.
Yeah. Also, to speak more generally on our process, so last year, when we first learned that we were going to be doing this exhibition, it initially started with a bunch of research where we were choosing texts, whether that be books, poems, articles, even podcasts, and we were listening to them, trying to get a general idea of what were the conversations around the natural world as of right now and also in the past, and how we could address those with specific works of art that we could put into the gallery. And once we sort of got an idea of the themes that we wanted to address from doing that initial research, we then kind of just went, like, in a way, like haywire with Googling, you know, like different artists and artworks that we could possibly get in the gallery. And, you know, the loan agreements were very difficult in some ways because they had to come from a lot of different parts of the world. So here what you really see is, in a way, like a very comprehensive, not all-encompassing, but a comprehensive approach to our process and the themes that we found were important. And yeah, then from there, we basically just started writing away, working on the text to adequately describe the artists and what their goals were through doing their work, and also the works themselves, and how we as viewers can form a connection with those works.
I would have a question for all of you. What would you do differently now that you've reached the culmination of this year-and-a-half endeavor? Is there anything about the exhibition that you didn't anticipate, an outcome that you didn't expect, or something you would like to do different or more of? Is there an art of trees too?
That's a tricky question. I don't know. I feel like this is a very big learning experience for me in particular. From my own personal background, I haven't really been that involved with, you know, visual art. I've been more in performance art, and I think this was an entirely new experience for me. And so it's hard to know what to do differently because this is kind of my first experience doing it. But it has been so incredibly rewarding, finding all of these pieces and getting to work with such lovely and motivated people to put together something as grand as this exhibition.
Something Willow and myself were actually discussing in a preliminary mini tour that we gave for the curatorial film curation group of Grand Gallery Associates was environmental justice. So I'll let Willow speak more about that.
I guess the neat thing about the film team actually still being in process is that I've actually asked them to take on a little bit more of the personal stories aspect and then the environmental justice conversation in terms of how what we've been doing, like we being the but like how the decisions we make about the environment on global scales impact individual lives, and how this exhibition, I think, ultimately actually ended up focusing more on the representations of nature, the representations of tree from many different standpoints. And some of those end up including stories like Bertinsky's or like Preston's that are a little bit more directly encountering the political and encountering those decisions. But I do think something I would want to explore more deeply is the personal encounters with issues of environmental justice, whether it be access to water or how these fields in the palm tree oil situation in the oil fields affected the individual lives there. Because as we mentioned with the aerial point of view for Bertinsky, he does leave you room to remain at a distance from the destruction you're witnessing. It's up to you to engage. Whereas other artists may ask you to engage with their experiences more directly.
I think there's something as human beings that we're drawn to in terms of human narratives. And so I think a strength in this exhibition is that it is sort of not devoid of human narratives, but it's definitely environmental centric, if that makes any sense. It really focuses on trees as actors, trees as the producers of art or the medium through which we work. But again, that also can be a bit of a weakness in a way. It can be seen as one because I think as humans we generally associate more to human stories and human narratives. And perhaps if there was an art of trees too, that could be included. Maybe.
Yeah.
Does that answer, I think, that? Yeah.
Well, I think this exhibition has raised so many questions for me about what environmental activism really is and what it should be. And I think that, I hope that all of you have enjoyed this experience. And although we'd like to do this in person, I hope that, we're able to kind of give you some access to the artwork and open up some new, ways of thinking, new perspectives as well on these issues that we've talked about today. So I think, do we have any more questions? I see
We have one more question, and then we'll probably need to kind of wrap it up, though this has been fabulous and everybody has been just commenting all over the place. So what do you think the art of trees can reveal about trees that the science of trees cannot offer? Can there be artistic knowledge or artistic truth? Whoa.
That's a very profound question.
Yeah. So how would you even approach that question? Maybe is the thing to think about
just
at
as
this
an
point.
art history major, the way trees are so recurring and the absence of trees, the presence of trees in terms of landscape and situating people in the context of different time periods is such an important sort of part of the discipline. But I also think that there's just something beautiful and indescribable about trees and the natural landscape, and I think that, in my opinion, is the art of trees.
In terms of something, I think that's the question is phrased in an interesting way because I think they are inseparable, which is kind of, the liberal arts answer. But I think that the art is replying to science, especially some of the works that have, I think that when I read about the artists, most of them had done their research. And they were responding directly to things that they saw in the science and the political and then in their actual lived experience in these places or with these trees. And so I think they're making it tangible for people who maybe don't access these questions and these experiences through written scientific work. And I think as much as we could optimistically say anyone can do that, they can be exclusive text. And so and galleries can also be exclusive in their own way, but I do think the aims of the artist were to make these conversations visible and interactable in a way that a scientific text couldn't alone.
And I think, sorry.
No, it's okay. Yeah.
The point of academic galleries are to open up these questions, and I think that's the beauty of the show. It doesn't give you a definite answer, and I don't think any exhibition should ever do that.
Exactly.
So I'll hand it over to you on
No,
that.
I 100% agree. I think, although we try to find this truth through science and through artwork, there really isn't a truth to all of this. There's a lot that's unknown and a lot that is up to our own interpretations, and we all experience the world differently. So there isn't really a single or a correct answer to that question. But it's very profound and gets you thinking, you know what I mean? I don't know.
Thanks. Yeah, thank you for that one. I think it's a good place to leave off on.
Yeah, I think
Yeah.
so too.
Yeah, I do too.
So, well, thank you again for joining us, and if you would like to watch it again, or if you know of anyone who wasn't able to catch the live version, the recording of this virtual tour will live on our website. Have a good evening.
Just